Joseph. In this segment, I want to talk about, we're going to go back in time a little bit. Last year, we talked about some of your books, the Cosmic War, and the Breakaway Civilization, Mars. But we didn't touch too much with the Nephilim, some of the religions, and some of the, I guess, maybe some of the connections with the biblical side of things. So I guess for those who may not know who or what the Nephilim are, who or what exactly are the Nephilim in the Bible, and does the biblical narrative of the Nephilim give us the watered down version of them?
Well, I don't think any version is the straight up version. I think they're all kind of watered down. The Nephilim are the beings that appear in Genesis chapter 11, where it records the sons of God beheld the daughters of men, that they were fair and so on, and they came down, intermarried, and spawned a race of giants. That story, when you compare it, and there are people that say that the comparison is there are scholars that argue no, that there's really not any comparison with the other stories from that region. But you have the Anunnaki in the Mesopotamian text, who again are these demigods or quasi-gods that come down, and in that version of the story actually genetically tinker with the human race in order to sire a kind of human god or demigod hybrid. And I cover this story in my book, Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, because it's a fascinating story when you get into it. Because in pretty much the biblical account, in the Mesopotamian accounts, even in some of the Egyptian accounts, you get a very similar story, that there was at some point, via some mechanism, either sexual intercourse or actual genetic interference, or some combination of the two, that there was an interference with humanity. Now, interestingly enough, the big division between the biblical account and the other accounts is that in the biblical account, humanity is already here, and the offspring of this experiment, or this hybridization sex program, was a race of giants. In other words, very large statured beings, in many cases with sexadigitism, 6 digits rather than 5, and in some stories about giants from around the world, double rows of teeth, and so on and so forth. So the sexadigitism has always been understood by some people familiar with the lore as being an indicator that you've got giant blood in you, okay? Or webbed fingers or webbed feet, things like that. I think there is something to it, because oddly enough, in the Mesopotamian accounts, if you take them as indicating this genetic project, and it's actually a set of tablets called the Kharsad tablets. I've got a copy of those. In those tablets, it's very interesting what you see happening, because from the side of the gods, the god part of this hybridization is a male, and the human side of this hybridization are, if I remember correctly, 13 or 14 females. And I thought this is just too weird that you would have those specific numbers mentioned in these ancient cuneiform texts, because one of the things that I did in that book, Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, was I looked at some of the genetic haplogroup historical research of people like Brian Sykes, the geneticist at Oxford, people like that are trying to look at mitochondrial DNA and determine major genetic groupings within the human genome. And by the same token, looking at Y chromosomes in men to determine, what's going on. And here's where it gets just downright bizarre, because Sykes found that there are, again, I'm not certain of the numbers, there are 13 or 14 major mitochondrial groupings within humanity. Now, I'm saying it that way because Sykes' findings and the actual cuneiform texts in terms of the number of females, mitochondrial DNA is passed down through the female. We all have it, but it's, we get it from our mothers. So the difference between Sykes and his research and these ancient cuneiform texts is off by one. Now, I'm sorry, but to my little hack from South Dakota mind, this is just too close for comfort. Somebody way back when knew a lot more about what was going on than meets the eye. And here's the other problem. The other problem is even a bigger whopper, because geneticists are now talking about things like mitochondrial Eve, because it's apparent from looking at human mitochondrial DNA that when you do the computer modeling and push it back, you come up with one mother for human mitochondrial DNA. So hence mitochondrial Eve. But that doesn't have anything to do with the book of Genesis. They quickly remind us, okay, well, if it doesn't, then what does? What qualifies in your opinion? But the oddest thing is they've done the same thing with Y chromosomes in males, human males. And they're now starting to talk about Y chromosomal Adam. Okay? And again, the name says it all. It's becoming apparent that we're more or less descended from one father. But here's the biggest problem. According to most geneticists, evolutionary biologists, whatever you want, the human race, the modern Homo sapiens sapiens species, doesn't really begin to arise until between, say, 150 to 200,000 years ago. And in some cases, it's 100,000 to 150, but you get the idea. It's a long time ago. But the problem with Y chromosomal Adam is it's looking like Y chromosomal Adam is about 100,000 years older than the human race itself. So, okay, again, we have a little problem here that would, golly, seem to be kind of resolved if you approach things from the standpoint of some of those ancient texts, which indicate, well, if we're going to have this big genetic project creating mankind, that they indicate that the male part of this project represented the divine part. And that would make it older than humanity. So, those texts, oddly enough, are beginning to be vindicated in odd little ways that you will never, I guarantee you 100%, you can place money on this bet, you will never get anybody within quackademia to acknowledge or talk about. They won't go there. But I do think that this idea of Nephilim, or somebody at some point in the mists of human history, prehistory, was doing some sort of experiment with us, I think is looking increasingly likely. There's just too much odd stuff in the human genome for it not to be the case. Why do we have so much DNA in common with pigs and chimpanzees and mice? Just a weird assortment of stuff.
Some ancient genetic tampering.
Some ancient, and we know what that got them. But anyway, here we are. and nothing's going to change that fact. So yeah, I think you have to start taking these texts seriously, particularly when you can go from, let's forget about Mesopotamia and the Bible for a minute and go to Mesoamerica with the Mayan Popol Vuh, where you've got a similar thing going on over here in Mesoamerica. Well, how did these Indians just happen to come up with the same basic story as a bunch of people in Babylon? That should tell us something. And I'm sorry, I'm not a believer in coincidence theory. I'll take a good conspiracy theory over a coincidence theory any day.
You mentioned, I think you said Genesis 11.
Mm-hmm.
Could have been Genesis 6.
Yeah, I meant
Genesis 6.
Yeah, I meant to say 6. 11 is Nimrod.
But I was wanting you to break down that a little bit more with Genesis 6, verse 4 in the Bible. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, also afterwards, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were heroes of old, men of renown.
Men of renown.
That's really my question.
What are the men of renown?
Yes.
Nimrod. Nimrod was a man of renown. In other words, they were conquerors. They were empire builders. And Nimrod, you recall, is the delightful chap that is implicated, at least in Genesis 11, as having to do with the Tower of Babel. He was a conqueror, first empire builder. So in other words, this experiment.
So he was a builder too?
Well, yeah.
What I'm saying, do you think some of these Masonic roots might go back to that also?
Well, some of the Masonic lodges clearly claim very, very ancient origins. Which is dicey from the standpoint if you're trying to look for continuity of an institution for all that time. No, I don't think that's the case. But if you look at some Masonic concepts and ideas, clearly I think some of those are very, very old. And clearly, there are many Masons that think that their society actually does come from Egypt, and you've even got things like the Memphite rite and so on within certain kinds of Masonry. So yeah, they clearly claim an Egyptian provenance. But I think in Masonry, particularly when you get out of the Blue Lodge, the first 3 degrees, and you get into the higher systems like the York Rite or the Scottish Rite, I think that when you start looking at those systems, you're really looking at kind of an amalgam of Egyptian, Babylonian, and in some cases even Jewish esotericism, in a lot of cases of Jewish esotericism that have been kind of synthesized in some of those higher degree systems.
But you were explaining a little bit more on Nimrod, and I kind of stopped your flow.
Well, if you look at the Tower of Babel story, to me, that story is peculiar in the Old Testament in a very significant way, because clearly the intention of the story is to communicate the idea that God intervened in something that mankind was doing. But if you look at the other instances in the Old Testament where you have a claim of direct divine intervention, Moses in the Exodus, or the Hebrews being taken into exile in Babylon and then released, and then all throughout the prophets you get this constant hammering home of the idea that if humanity is faithful to the covenant, then God will be faithful to humanity, and if humanity isn't faithful to the covenant, God's going to come down here and knock some heads together. In other words, it's the cause of these interventions is always human sin. But if you look at the Tower of Babel story, no. We're talking, not you. Okay? Thank you, Shiloh. You be a good girl. Lay down. If you look at the Tower of Babel story, that's peculiar because it doesn't say that what they're doing is wrong and sinful and we've got to go down there and knock some heads together. Okay, it doesn't say that. What it says is, if they finish this tower which can reach unto heaven, if they finish this, then they will be able to do whatsoever they imagine to do.
Sound like some alchemical stuff.
Bingo! Bingo!
I told you everything's connected, man.
Reach to heaven, yes. Claw your way back up that ladder, back up Jacob's ladder to heaven, okay? And they'll be able to do whatsoever they imagine to do. In other words, I think what the tower represents, it's not that, it's not these Renaissance paintings that we saw in Sunday school, where they're trying to build this skyscraper.
Some of them don't relate.
Yeah, and some of them are kind of, No, get that out of your head. The tower is a metaphor for being able to reach and understand, so to speak, the physics of heaven.
Like an alchemical
concept. It's a concept. It's a cosmological power. It's a heavenly power that's being suggested. And that they're about constructing something, whatever it may be, that they think is going to give them that. And, apparently they're on the right track, because you've got God himself saying, well, if they finish this, we're in deep doo-doo. So we better go down there. And the response is even more interesting. Because what's the response? How are you going to screw up? Let's just pretend we're celestial black projects engineers in 2400,000 BC. And we're constructing our tower unto heaven. Well, how are we going to screw up a project like that? Well, the simplest way is to go down there and make sure that nobody can understand each other. Get them all using different systems of measure or using different words for the same thing. That's really going to put a damper in the whole project. So it's kind of a guerrilla warfare. It's interesting. We would call it asymmetrical warfare now. It's not, I'm going to smash that tower. No, I'm just going to make it so that they can't get along and complete the dang thing. So to me, it's always been an unusual story, precisely because of that, because it's a little indicator, even in the Bible, that you've got some sort of very sophisticated civilization or culture, and it's got some sort of sophisticated physics or science that it's working on, and it poses a threat. And a threat, the implication is they're going to be able to do whatsoever they imagine to do to each other. So if we're gonna save these little hairless monkeys, we better go down and do something about it.
So I guess, what was the general opinion of the early church fathers concerning these giants and or Nephilim?
Oh, well, if you read, you don't have to read very far to discover that a lot of those very early church fathers, particularly from the era of what are known as the apologists, the apologetical writers, which would be the first century up to about 250 AD. So there was a pretty extensive period of time, and you've got a lot of people that most moderns have never even heard of, writing about this stuff, Arnobius and people like this. Well, if you look at what they're writing, they have no difficulty with there being actual giants, and they will even, in many cases, refer to lore about them that you can only learn about by reading these people, because that's the only record of it in existence anymore. So they had no problem with any of it. What's more interesting to me is, since I dealt with patristics for so long, what's interesting to me, Shiloh, she's you're spoiling her. You take your hand away and she's going to growl. Yeah, I want my rub.
Didn't you get your doctorate in portrait?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've dealt with these texts most of my life. What's interesting to me about their attitude towards these things and the modern attitude is that they're day and night apart from each other. For example, the modern attitude is if a modern learns that you had all of these religions way back then that had the idea of a dying son of God who rises again, that this is a disproof of Christianity. That would be the modern response to it. The ancients thought exactly the opposite. It was no big deal to them. What it meant to them was there's something about this story that is implanted or embedded in the cosmos itself. It's part of the structure of it. So we have to explain not the similarities between these stories. We got to figure out why are some of them different in these little details. But it didn't upset them at all that these stories were there. So their attitude to all of these things was very different. And the reason I mention that is when you get to the Nephilim, my impression has always been that if you were to have a conversation with someone like, say, St. Justin Martyr about the Nephilim and the idea that somebody was deliberately tinkering with the human genome, it probably wouldn't have bothered him at all. He would have said, yes, exactly, and blah, blah, blah. To the modern, this is taken as an indicator, well, all of these stories were just about science. They had nothing to do with God or religion or anything of the sort. So again, it's a consequence of that reduction of reason, the human reason, to the merely rationating part of our rational faculty. To the ancients, no, it was a subset of a huge grand story that they were trying, just like we are, trying to figure out, well, how does this all fit in? How do we make consistent sense out of all of this? So they wouldn't have looked at it with the suspicion or negativity that moderns do, and particularly modern religious people do. It would have been no problem to them.
So it's kind of this is part one of this question. About a couple questions I want to ask you here in just a minute. One of them, many say that the Nephilim are still here on Earth today, either genetically through the elite's bloodlines or actually physically, possibly living within, you could say, the inner Earth or whatever. What's your take on that, Joseph?
I think it's possible, and I'll tell you why.
Like physically and or genetically through bloodlines? Both?
Both.
Okay.
The reason I say that is, while I do believe that it is impossible to completely eradicate the human soul, in other words, it's always going to be there. It's always going to manifest itself somehow. I do believe that it is possible so to traumatize it that its innate natural propensity toward virtue and morality are short-circuited and twisted or turned inward on itself. Think of the devil. The devil in Christian theology is an angel, a cherub, that by simple personal force of will turned his personhood into complete opposition to his own nature. And, Thomas Aquinas has a brilliant way of explaining why demons are locked into this pattern, and that's because they're in a timeless existence, so that the first exercise or choice of will simultaneously establishes their habit of will. We live in time, so our habit of will is formed by several choices over a period of time. And with angels, in his thinking, because they're in a timeless existence, that's not so. So that personal opposition to their very own nature, it's like they're in a constant state of death. They're constantly struggling with themselves. So I do think that it may be possible through God knows what sort of black project to atrophy, either by genetics or some other method or combination thereof, to atrophy that natural inclination of the soul toward virtue and goodness and beauty and truth and so on and so forth, to atrophy it to the point that you get a person who has to learn responses that come naturally to other people. Think of the narcissist. The narcissist literally has to pretend to feel emotions that they do not have the experience of. They have to pretend to be interested in other people. They have to pretend to care for other people. But in the final analysis, they're just narcissists. I think that's a natural inclination that may have been brought out. So let's look at the Nephilim. If by a prolonged experiment you've managed to inculcate or breed out of a creature certain traits and breed into a creature other traits, then over time the physical appearance is going to be there, but the moral appearance, the moral character, is going to be so atrophied it won't be visible. And the only way to detect these kinds of people, because they look like us, they walk like us, they quack like us, and so on, the only way to detect them is how? Genetically.
Rh negative blood?
It's got to be some marker. You know, I thought it was very interesting when Scott and I were doing the transhumanism book. He found this website of the Department of Energy at Knoxville, Tennessee. And the Department of Energy now is looking for genetic markers for homosexuality, alcoholism, ear twitching, tongue curling, and perfect pitch in music. Now, what a, you know, you can't sit around and make up a list like that, but there it was. So we were just like, okay, why are they looking for all this stuff for genetic markers of it? And what that tells me is they're looking for something deeper. And my suspicion is now, and you know, I even mentioned this at the Secret Space Program conference down in Bastrop in 2015. My suspicion is now you've got what? We've got all of these genetic technologies that have emerged in just the last 4 to 5 years. CRISPR. You've got these genetic sequencing lab kits now that the government has that can sequence you in the field. You don't have to take your DNA, put it in an envelope, send it to a lab in, you know, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and wait for 5 weeks. You know, they run it through the sequencer and you get your result. You can do it in the field in an hour. Why would you need to sequence anybody's DNA in the field? Unless they're looking for something. Precisely. And that's what I think they're doing. I think they're looking for people that look like us but ain't us.
Is it because if they're looking for whatever it is, and if, let's say they find it, then that's when the questions arise. Because what would they want with those people?
Precisely.
Experimentation.
Extermination. Who knows? I don't know.
Just like I said, all of this is one giant picture.
It's one giant picture. Yes, it is. Yeah.
I'm getting goosebumps.
In my opinion, I'm with you. In my opinion, it's one giant picture. Because let's go back and let's talk about giants again for just a moment. Have you seen those Babylonian cylinder seal impressions? You know what a cylinder seal is? Well, they roll the cylinder on a piece of wet clay, and when you roll it out flat, you see the whole picture. Okay? Well, if you've looked at some of those pictures, you oftentimes see the Lugal-e, the big man. It's literally what it is. And he's sitting on a throne. Big throne, big man. And you got a tiny little human coming up to big human with some sort of gift or maybe a plate of food or whatever it is. Big man. And that was our word for the king. Okay, so academics look at these pictures and they say, well, big man means king. And the king is portrayed big to represent his power. Typical academic reasoning. But we've got those texts that say, no, there were giants, giant people, large stature people. Even Columbus finds these people, when he lands and sees Indians that are beyond 7 feet tall. He's a little Italian squirt looking up at this thing. So, I think we have to get out of our academic boxes and blinders and look at some of our academic boxes and say, well, maybe these people are not depicting metaphors. Maybe they're depicting what they actually saw. Who knows? And the only thing to distinguish between, local Homo sapiens sapiens and Homo whatever it was sitting on the big chair is the stature and genetics. Otherwise, they look the same, walk the same, and so on.
Now, maybe modern academia and maybe some element within the government, whatever, maybe they are trying to find these genetic markers within people, and they may actually have these physical evidence, which has been theorized. Well, I won't even say theorized or speculated, because it's almost known for a fact that the Smithsonian Institute is covering up, and other.
I think they are.
They're covering up these ancient skeletal remains of these giants.
Now, mind you, my uncle would say that that's just nuts. My uncle at one time was the budget director for the Smithsonian Institution, and he would say that's just nuts.
It's all departmentalized.
Well, precisely. But I do think that there's enough prima facie evidence out there to suggest that there's been some sort of suppression of certain types of archaeological evidence, that being one of them, people of large stature. We have in history certain cases of human gigantism that causes the people that suffer it, massive amounts of health complications. But, there was one fellow, a famous case of this guy in Great Britain that was over 9 feet tall. 9 feet. That's half, again, as tall as you and I. And, and we're looking up at...
And that famous wrestler, Andre the Giant, I think he was pushing 8 feet, 7, 6, or 7, something like that.
Yeah. So it's not, it's not beyond the possibility of physical reality. So maybe we're looking at a case where those ancient experiments discovered that gene for gigantism and made it not a copying error or a mutation that rarely occurs, but, copied and pasted it with their version of CRISPR enough times to create an entire species out of it. There's any way to talk about it. Exactly.
Goes back into the picture.
Exactly.
So, could the Nephilim, we kind of, a while ago we talked about, could the Nephilim be still here on Earth today, either genetically or through the least bloodline? So, we already kind of established that, what we think is going on there. Could the Nephilim possibly be a player behind the many religions on Earth? If that is true, what would be the reason and or agenda of the Nephilim to create, if they did, the many religions we have here on Earth?
Conflict. It's to keep that Tower of Babel asymmetric warfare going. Conflict. Keep people divided. I mean, if you look at, I think, and I'm not trying to pick on one religion here, but if you look at the origins of Islam, there are aspects of the way that religion originated in their own understanding that looks very much like someone was deliberately driving and manipulating an agenda. Because it starts out one thing and it ends up another.
Sure.
Yeah. It ends up way different than the way it started out. So there was some sort of manipulation going on there, and I don't think that I'm one of those that doesn't even have to go to hidden hands like Nephilim. I think there was a strong possibility that there was a great deal of potential manipulation from the Byzantine Empire at certain points. So, I don't have any...
I was about to ask you about that, Joseph. Could they also be the hidden hand behind many of the world events throughout history?
I have no difficulty with that.
It makes a lot of sense.
If you start looking at what I call the weirdnesses of history, look at all the murky stuff in the background of World War I sometimes,
mm-hmm.
and you have some of the most Byzantine plotting and scheming that you can imagine being done by Great Britain prior to that war. I mean, forget about the Germans. They're kind of Johnny-come-latelys to the game. You look at that. You look even at the 30 Years' War in some instances, and there's definitely an esoteric hand in some of that stuff going on in that war. It wouldn't surprise me. In other words, going back to World War I, if you look at the Austro-Hungarian trial transcripts of the ring of assassins behind the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, they very clearly come out and mention some of those esoteric secret society influences. Shiloh.
She can't stand whenever I quit her.
No.
She wants to join the conversation.
I know she does.
Yeah. She's going to be the first non-human entity.
Interviewee on your interviews. Yes, we hear you, but you're not contributing to the conversation.
But there she is, fellas.
There she is. Thank you, Shiloh. Thank you. Yes, thank you for the dog kisses. All right. Now you go lay down. Yeah, you go lay down. Go lay down. Be a good girl. You go lay down.
But you're right, though. All you have to do is
dig,
and
you find these influences.
And you see these strange things, such as Jeffrey Epstein.
Well,
weird cases with that. All you have to do is find these little things like that, and you start connecting the dots, and you see the bigger picture. But we just get labeled conspiracy theories.
Well, let's go back to something I said at Bastrop, at the Secret Space Program Conference in Bastrop. In my first talk there, I was talking about what I call the Versailles template of the cosmic war. Okay, if we fought a cosmic war, and I've always said that the Epic of Ninurta looks to me, it's not an epic. I mean, when you sit down and read it, it's about as exciting as reading the index to the Sears catalog. I mean, it's just dreadfully dull because it's nothing but an index. It's an inventory of stuff. Well, my template for understanding that was World War I, because what did the Allies do at the end of World War I? They took an inventory of the German war machine and said, oh my word, we survived this. Well, okay, you Germans, we don't want you building any of this stuff again. And we're going to cart a bunch of it off and use it ourselves. Well, this is exactly what you see in the Epic of Ninurta. But the other thing that the Versailles Treaty did, and you have hints of this in that ancient lore that talks about this cosmic war. This is what's so interesting. The Versailles Treaty demilitarized the Rhineland. In other words, this whole area of Germany was prohibited from having any German troops stationed inside that zone, west of the Rhine River. In other words, they're pushing the mobilization jump-off point for any future conflict with the German military back behind the Rhine River. Give us time this time, guys, before you come for us. So that was the first thing. The second thing was they restricted the German military to a certain size. that it could not build beyond. Well, that was the worst thing we could have done, because what the Germans did was they turned that tiny little army after World War I that they were permitted to have into a cadre army. So when rearmament came, bump that 100,000 people up, and you've got instant officer corps capable of gobs of staff work, which was the last thing we wanted them to have, but they did it. But if you look at it, you have a quarantine zone around Germany. So what did the Allies do to make sure that the Germans were keeping the treaty? They were permitted by the treaty to have their military attachés throughout Germany go into any German industrial plant and make sure that they weren't building the stuff that they shouldn't be building. Okay, now let's go to the ancient cosmic war. If you read things like the Book of Enoch, you discover that there's a quarantine zone around the planet Earth. And it's either at the orbit of the moon or it's at the orbit of the seventh planet, which back then would have been Saturn, interestingly enough. And in addition to that, if that's part of some ancient cosmic Versailles, who are the military attachés? They're going to keep a watch on these hairless monkeys on this planet to make awful darn sure that we're not going to build some other planet-busting device. Well, they're called what? The Watchers.
Yeah, the Watchers.
The Watchers. What are the Watchers doing? Why are they here watching? Just to keep an eye on us and make sure we progress acceptably?
Maybe we don't blow each other up.
Or blow each other up, or them. Yeah. So in other words, I think all the indications are there that we've got somebody that the lore says was left behind here to keep a watch on what we're doing, to make sure that we're not going to start doing certain things they don't want us to do. Think Tower of Babel again. So in other words, this whole asymmetrical warfare model, I'm next to insistent. This is what I think you're seeing in those ancient texts. They're telling us in so many words, if you're willing to read them from the standpoint of a modern military analyst, they're telling us in so many words that we're being kept an eye on because we created a great big upheaval way in the distant past.
And you hear that these Watchers are also angels.
Mm-hmm.
Are they one and the same, Joseph?
They could be. Yeah, they could be.
And also, let's entertain the fact that these.
Let me expand on that, because if you look at certain types of astrological lore, if you look at certain types of angelology in Christian theology, you have not only guardian angels of individuals, but you have guardian angels of nations, or in other words, groups of people, and you have guardian angels of planets, in other words, planetary intelligences. C.S. Lewis wrote his whole space trilogy, kind of based around that theme. Mm-hmm. So, in ancient times, a horoscope was not cast for an individual, it was cast for a king. And the reason it was cast for a king was that the king represented an aggregate group of people. So in other words, astrology was here it comes, a statistical science.
Maybe to help predict the future also.
Bingo. Statistics. We go back to what I said about Isaac Asimov in the Foundation trilogy. If you're dealing with the science of planetary effects on an aggregate population, that's a science. When you're pulling a little booklet of sun signs off the grocery store aisle telling you that you're going to win the lottery tomorrow, no, that's no longer science. That's a good bet in a casino, or maybe a bad bet in a casino.
The Farmer's Almanac.
Right. What's the Farmer's Almanac doing?
It's just another
statistic
throughout ancient times all the way to modern day.
Mm-hmm.
It's not technically scientific, but it's the.
Well, here's the rub. If you look at what the ancient Babylonians and Egyptians tell you about their astrology, what they will tell you, and I'm not even paraphrasing very loosely here, they will tell you that their astrological charts were based on observations made over tens of thousands of years. In other words, what they're telling you was that at one time this was a statistical science. That's what they're telling you, that we've since lost. And now we're just kind of getting back to, when there's a full moon, people go nuts. Ask any law enforcement officer. Yeah. Well, what's that? What's up with that? Why is that so? Well, it's a physics. There's a physics behind this that has an effect on biological systems, and vice versa. This is a two-way street, not a one-way street.
And I didn't really mean for this to come up to the conversation, but it makes you wonder if the moon does play. Because we're going to get back on the Nephilim and the walkthroughs and angels here in just a second. But it makes you wonder, with the moon, was it placed into orbit around Earth to act on something within our subconscious, react on our psyche?
If you're dealing with people with a science like that, then anything that they do is going to be done through careful calculation of the sum total of effects. So the answer is yes. And was the moon placed? Well, Isaac Newton's famous statement was, the statement attributed to him was, the moon is the only thing that gives me a headache. Why? Because the physics of the moon doesn't work. And it doesn't matter which model of how the moon came to be that you use. If the moon came out of the planet Earth, then it should not be in a nearly perfectly circular orbit around the Earth, rotating on its own axis in such a way, while orbiting the Earth, that we only see about 60% of the surface of it at any one time. And it's always the same 60%.
And it perfectly hides the sun.
And it perfectly hides the sun during lunar eclipses and so on and so forth. On and on we could go. And if the moon was captured by the Earth, that's even more problematic, because if it was captured by the Earth, it's going to be in an elliptical orbit, just like a ball, a golf ball rolling around a bowling ball placed on a trampoline. If you shoot the golf ball at it and the gravity captures the golf ball, it's going to be in an elliptical orbit doing this. The moon's not doing that. The capture model doesn't work. In other words, someone parked it there. It had to slow down
or something.
If it was careening through the solar system and the Earth's gravity captured it, somebody put on the brakes.
I got one for you, Jay. You got this, my mind ticking right now. It's about to explode, actually. But okay, last year we talked about the cosmic war, breakaway civilization, the war in the heavens, etc. And you talk about it in many of your books. Okay, let's say this cosmic war. You talked about which planet was it that exploded?
Tiamat.
Okay, let's say, before I get into that, in the ancient world, we had dinosaurs. We had all these huge, enormous creatures. Maybe these huge, enormous creatures, maybe they were able to get such size, maybe because the moon wasn't in orbit back then. I'm almost finished with, hold on. Maybe because the moon wasn't in orbit back then. And then, during that time, maybe this ancient cosmic war was taking place. And then, let's say, all this cosmic upheaval, wars and everything happened, and this planet Tiamat exploded, and somehow the Earth captured one of the debris that came from this war, which is the moon now.
Won't work.
Won't work?
No, won't work. As I said, the capture model, if the moon is careening in and is captured by the Earth, the orbit that it's going to have will be a huge ellipse. The fact that it's in a circle means that as it's coming in towards the Earth from wherever, someone had to put on the retro rockets. Someone had to park it. That's not debris. that ain't debris. Dinosaurs is different. There's actually a theory out there. I'm not a subscriber to it, but there's actually a theory out there by some very strange people that think that dinosaurs are the surest indication that the Earth's gravitational field has shifted dramatically over time.
Gravitational field too?
Yeah. The Earth's gravitational field has become much stronger than it used to be. Hence, we had great big dinosaurs.
That's why I was wondering, could the moon have played a factor in that?
No, I don't think so. No. I think if you're looking for influences of the moon on terrestrial biology and behavior, then you're going to have to look at the electrodynamics of the system rather than the gravitational dynamics of the system. Because fundamentally, I think the solar system is an electrodynamic system, and that's one of the fundamental forces in play, rather than gravity, is electromagnetism.
So let's get back to the Nephilim.
Mm-hmm.
Are the Anunnaki,
mm-hmm.
the Epic of Gilgamesh,
mm-hmm.
because we know many authors have talked about the Anunnaki, one Zachariah Sitchin.
Mm-hmm.
Could they actually be the Nephilim mentioned in the Bible?
I think yes. I think the parallels are too great, with the principal exception between the biblical and the Babylonian stories being that in the Babylonian story they're responsible for engineering modern mankind into existence, and in the biblical version of the story, the Nephilim are responsible for perverting a species already here. And I think personally, I think there's something to be said for both views.
Now, you see this every now and then. The Anakim. Anakim.
Okay.
What exactly is the Anakim, if I'm pronouncing that correctly?
This is a term I've not heard before.
I was just wondering if you come across that, or the Anakites.
No. You'd have to give me more context to go on than that.
Because I asked few of my subscribers, and because I told on my Instagram account that I was going to be interviewing you and asked if they want to bring a few questions into play. That's something I'll have to look into.
Well, they're going to have to give me more context for it. The term is vaguely familiar, but I hesitate to give any response to it without knowing the context of their question. To me, that's always the most important part of the question: is why are they asking it? What's the information? What's the process of reasoning behind it?
But we touched on this already a little bit. But according to your research with the Cosmic War, which like I said, we talked vastly about last year, where do the fallen angels, like I said, we talked about it a little bit, but where do they fit into the scheme of things, according to your research? Are the fallen angels sort of like the ancient super soldiers of the ancient past that fell to Earth during the ancient cosmic war?
Well, you certainly have traditions like that in apocryphal books like Enoch and so on, that they took on a bodily form and actually fell to the planet. I personally do believe in the existence of fallen angels. In other words, spirit beings, or whatever you wish to call them, that have given themselves over to evil. I don't think you can explain a lot of stuff that goes on in human history without it, quite frankly. I don't think humans by nature are inclined that way unless they're given a push, like we've been talking about. I suspect, let's put it this way, I suspect that somewhere in the bowels of all of the Black Project's world, that someone in that world, the breakaway group, whatever you want to call it, has deliberately attempted to make a scientific study of the occult and of ceremonial magic and things like that to see why it works and to have some sort of explanation as to why it works. And as a result of that, and I'm basing this on pure intuition rather than much evidence. There's a little bit of evidence that this sort of thing was done, but it's, in my opinion, it's too sketchy to say that you can make a good evidentially argued case out of it. So what I'm saying is speculation and intuition primarily. But as a result of that project, I think that at some point, that Black Project's world attempted to make actual contact with entities like that for the purposes of using them, which is always a big mistake. Read your Goethe, folks. To acquire more power. And for that, there is some evidence in that you only have to look at the occult trappings around events like 9/11 or events like the Kennedy assassination, which is full of Masonic and other occult symbolism. And most particularly, the celestial ritual magic that appears to be going on in the American space program. Think of what Richard Hoagland argued in his, and I think did quite a good job of it in his book, Dark Mission. I think there's an aspect of the space program that's deeply, deeply occult. And you only have to look at Jack Parsons, founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Well, here's a guy that is an associate of Aleister Crowley, doing rituals, sex magic rituals, no less. Here we go again, to give himself more power. There's that aspect of things, that they're doing this celestial magic. And interestingly enough, since I talked earlier about reverse magic in Christianity, what were the Soviets doing? And what are the Russians doing now in their space program?
Well, they tend to be exploding a lot of things over there.
No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about in terms of this idea of space as a realm for magical operation. What were they doing?
Like,
this will bake your noodle.
Bake it.
Every now and then, the Soviets will, when they send something up to the space station or they put something in orbit, they'll put a relic of a saint up there, or they'll put an icon up there. It's almost as if they knew, even in the Soviet era, that they were looking at what we were doing and all of our black celestial magic, and they decided, we're going to do the exact opposite. And that's what they did. So, there's an aspect, we talk about secret space program, and everybody's thinking in terms of okay, we've got all of this super secret technology that we're developing, and we're sending people out there with it now and not telling anybody about it. But there's another aspect of secret space program that's all of this occult ritual stuff that nobody's noticing except, if you're people like Richard Hoagland, he's the guy that's going to notice it. And the Soviets doing the exact opposite. Buzz Aldrin goes up and has a little Masonic communion service on the moon. The Soviets are orbiting icons of Saint Sergius of Radonezh. And just
keeps getting more bizarre.
Yeah, it does. It does.
But while you were speaking,
that to me is the real secret space program.
But I got a few more questions for you to round things up. But I looked it up. The Anakim, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, were described as a race of giants descended from Enoch, according to the Tanakh. They were said to have lived in the southern part of the land of Canaan.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, the Anak, I know who you're talking about now.
And you were talking about some of this in Genesis 14, verse 5 and 6. Og,
king of Bashan. If you read the descriptions of his bed in the Old Testament, he was clearly a pretty big fella, because his bed is, not your normal queen-size bed. It's very long. Yeah, I know who you're talking about now. Yeah, they were...
So there's several races of these giants.
Yeah. Well, I think so. According to the lore, they've got one thing in common. They've got sexadigitatism in common.
Yeah.
Goliath, David versus Goliath, he was a giant, right?
Yeah.
You've got cases of sexadigitatism. Some people report seeing these giant skulls with double rows of teeth and so on. So they've got some sort of physiological difference. One thing that is interesting is a lot of the lore records them as being cannibals. And I think that there's even either an Old Testament reference to that or some apocryphal Old Testament reference to that, and I can't remember exactly where it is. But yeah, they're clearly present in the Old Testament narrative. The book of Enoch is not part of the Hebrew canon, but if you read the book of Enoch, particularly in the Slavonic text, you get the idea that the giants of the Old Testament are descended from these Nephilim and their giant offspring.
So, do all the world religions worship the same God? Or do they each worship different ancient deities that possibly correlate with your research into the ancient cosmic war? And if that's the case, Joseph, maybe all these different religious gods across the world were actually once with war with each other in the distant past. Maybe that's why Earth has been in a perpetual state of wars, turmoil, hate, etc. since the dawn of man. Because the ancient cosmic war of the gods somehow made an imprint within the very fabric of our consciousness of the human race.
That's quite a tall drink of water. Well, first of all, I'm going to say I don't believe in a God in general.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is my belief is thoroughly Christian. For me, God is the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Mm-hmm. It's not this whatever that most people think of. Supreme being, all of that stuff. But the idea of gods, of religions, the problem there is how you're defining religion, because, Buddhism or Confucianism, things like that aren't so much religions as they are philosophies. Confucianism being a philosophy of cosmology and government, things like that. They don't have, insofar as there's a God, it's kind of like the ancient Romans would have looked at it. The real God is the genius of Roman administration, or if you're Confucian, Mandarin administration.
But I guess to break it down even, more. I could have.
Maybe I'm not understanding the question.
You're going along with it, but I kind of worded it too much. I could have made it shorter, but ever since the ancient times, there seems to be war, turmoil,
right?
Just division. Could that be a trait all the way? Because even today, it's like that. The wars, religious wars, the turmoil, plagues, just a lot of nasty things. Could that be an influence? Something along the human psyche, consciousness, because of what happened in the ancient past, of maybe with all these, the ancient cosmic war that you talked about, because...
In other words, are you saying, are the gods still around? Do their houses still exist? And are we still suffering the implications of their own animosities?
Yeah.
Well, I think to a certain extent that's true. And again, to me, World War I is such a key war in terms of its symbolism. Because what you see going on there is almost like someone looked at those ancient cosmic war stories, the Greeks with their gigantomachy, and the Babylonians with Marduk and Tiamat and so on and so forth. Osiris and Set, If you look at World War I, what do you see? Well, Kaiser Wilhelm II is the grandson of Queen Victoria of England. He's the cousin to Tsar Nicholas II. He is related to the Habsburgs. In other words, it's one big family fight. About the only one without a family stake in the game are the French, because they don't have the monarchy anymore, although the Bourbon family is still there to this day.
Yeah.
They've got a Dauphin in France. But that's exactly what you see in the Cosmic War. You see all these gods who are related to each other. If you go through all of the texts, and, this god is descended from that god, and so on and so forth, and they're fighting each other. I think you could be looking at something that maybe impressed itself into the human psyche. I don't know. By some means, I don't know. For me, the real question is not what are you willing to kill for, but what are you willing to die for? And that's when things change immensely. Because that forces you to orient your priorities. It changes the perspective. And right now, unfortunately, we're dealing with too many people that are thinking along the lines of what am I willing to kill for, rather than what I'm willing to die for. And once you start thinking in those terms, then you've got to start sitting down and really going through the priorities, not only with yourself, but what is it that you see as the primary things of merit and value in this civilization that are worth preserving to the point of your own life. That's the key.